to Silent Command Stream. This is video number 2. In this video, we're going to talk about the wrist flick. And hopefully you don't mind this insane construction noise that's happening behind us. So the wrist flick is the most important part of what we do as drum majors. And it's something that can often kind of go unnoticed and unmentioned because it's so fundamental, and you see it and you recognize, okay, I can read that pattern, but it's kind of hard to know why you can read it. So let's talk about what exactly the wrist flick is, right? The wrist flick, and I'll demonstrate. The wrist flick is when you contact the ictus and there's a brief pop that shows exactly where the downbeat is. Pop. That right there is a wrist flick. And the reason that the wrist flick is difficult but important is because we're going to be tempted to use a lot of different muscles that we don't need to use. So let me show you what I'm talking about. Wrist flick. Hopefully you can read my terrible handwriting too. So thing number 1 about the wrist flick is it's entirely facilitated by the arm, right? And you may say, Samuel, if it's called the wrist flick, why is it facilitated by the arm? Well, it's called the wrist flick because the wrist participates passively. Let me show you what I mean by that. Passive wrist. So we'll talk about the rebound in the next video, but when I'm coming up and down from my rebound, I contact the ictus, and then my passive wrist has no choice but to flick. And we want about 30 degrees of flick, right? This is the amount of angle that we want. You'll see some drum majors, especially young drum majors, that will do a flick that they think goes down this far, but that produces floppiness in the wrist and is going to encourage you to move from the wrist and not from the arm. So let me grab a stand and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So if the ictus is my stand right here, right? If the ictus is my stand, about right here, when I contact the ictus, it is going to automatically stop my forearm from moving, like so, forearm stoppage, and then I have no choice but to flick just a little bit. So in real time, it's going to look like this. It's that simple. And the thing that makes that flick so rigid and so smooth at the same time is the fact that I'm stopping with the muscles in my forearm, not moving the muscles in my wrist. So let me show you the difference in those two things. So if I stop with the forearm, it looks like this. I'm flexing my forearm when I contact the ictus, causing that stoppage as if the stand was still there. And then the cartilage in my wrist has no choice but to continue on and do that microscopic little flick. So I'm not totally relaxing that cartilage, but the primary muscular movement comes from in here. Now let me show you the wrong way. This is what it looks like when I move from the muscles in my wrist and not by stopping my forearm muscles. Right? That is what we do not want, because there I'm using this muscle, which is going to tire out easily, and number 2, I'm using that muscle, which is going to be much less precise and cause a bigger motion. So, facilitated by the arm, by the forearm, and the wrist has to be passive. So some ways to check on what you're doing correctly. And we're going to have some slow-mo video right here that's going to show you what we're talking about. But the way that we check on our wrist flick is by looking from the side, taking a slow-mo video. If you have an iPhone, you can do that. iPad, you can do that. It's great. Take a slow-mo video from the side, and when you contact the ictus, check to see how much wrist flick is happening. On that still image, you're going to want about this much, right? And you're going to want to check to make sure that when you contact the ictus, that you're parallel in your forearm. That's the very clear distinction that you're doing the wrist flick correctly, right? You want that clear distinction of stoppage in the forearm, continuing with the wrist. I'll go through a few analogies that we sometimes hear and tell you why they're good or bad, right? So a lot of the times you'll hear people say, imagine that you're hitting a hot stove, that you're touching a hot stove, right? And that's an okay analogy. There's some things I like about it and some things that I don't. So just think about it. Again, I'll use the stand. If this stand is my hot stove, when I contact it, the thing that is going to be encouraged by the hot stove analogy is moving the wrist. Like this. That, again, is not the motion that we want. So the hot stove analogy gives you the idea of the little light touch to the ictus that we do want with the wrist flick, but it doesn't quite capture the stoppage of the arm and then the continuation of the wrist, right? So I'll just sort of draw you a little timeline of what needs to happen with the wrist flick, right? So first we have number one, here's our little timeline. Number one, first event is downward motion, stoppage, stopped arm. Number two, wrist continues. And number three will be rebound. Woo. Cool. So those are really the three big points. We're going to talk about rebound in the next video. But in review, come down, contact ictus, hand briefly continues. A little bit of tenseness in the hand, but most of our intensity comes from the forearm. And this wrist flick, this element of our conducting gives us clarity, and it gives us a consistent pattern and a consistent contact with the ictus that we can use. The conducting vocabulary word that is associated with this contact of the ictus is called tact. T-A-K-T. So when you hear me say tact, I'm always talking about our contact with the ictus, T-A-K-T. So this is how you need to approach the wrist flick, and this is the way that you want to think about contacting the ictus every time. All forearm, a little bit of wrist, 80-20. Next video, we're going to talk about the rebound and how to approach the ictus and use our movement through time and space clearly and succinctly and make good use of this rebound. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.